terrific arrangements, and I want to thank everyone for the warm welcome we've already had. My wife Nicole is with me here tonight, and both already had just wonderful conversations and learned a lot, and also heard some fascinating life stories. So we're very, very happy to be able to share the evening with you. And what I thought I would try to do after that overwhelming introduction, which I very much appreciate, is talk a little bit about two things. First of all, where America stands in terms of the challenges in the world today and how well we are equipped to deal with it, given some of the problems that Ernie just touched on, what we need to do to be able to meet those challenges, and what our country needs to do to be ready for what is already happening and what I think is coming. But let me start with this moment in our history, in the world's history. I was privileged, as Ernie mentioned, to be one of the people who worked on ending the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. I was part of a generation of young American diplomats and think tankers and academics who had a very, very hopeful, I would say, maybe naively hopeful view of what the future could be, and then started to see it happen and started to see some of those hopeful visions come to pass. And we were part of what I think everybody in this room will remember as a very optimistic moment in which everything seemed to be breaking our way. And when I say our, I don't just mean the United States, but the West, we and our allies together, the liberal democracies. And the sense was that we, after a very tough time, obviously the Vietnam years and the 70s, which I grew up in, which were not an easy time in so many ways, but finally this awful Cold War was ending, and we had the opportunity to remake it, or help remake it, in our own image almost. That was the excitement, and I would say to some extent the hubris of that time. It wasn't entirely wrong, because miracle of miracles, the Soviet Union more or less came apart peacefully. There was some violence, there were some unfortunate incidents, but they were small. And equally importantly, the massive nuclear arsenal that the Soviet Union had, that we were legitimately so afraid of, was peacefully brought under control, consolidated, and what we used to have nightmares about, the possibility of what we call loose nukes, did not come to pass. And initially, we were able to advance the causes we felt so strongly about, which were the cause of freedom, which we had mostly, I would say, furthered and promoted during the Cold War, but also the concept of free market economics, the concept of individual liberty, rejection of collectivism, and then the sense that we have the magic formula. So there were all sorts of terms back then, the Washington Consensus, the famous book by Frank Fukuyama, The Last Man and the End of History, which has been oversimplified, but the argument basically was we had the formula, no one else had any formulas that were worth anything, and we just could, basically sit back and things would go our way, and that led to what we then called the peace dividend. And what the peace dividend meant was we get to win, and not only don't we have to pay to win, but they're going to pay us for it. How great is that? We win, and we get paid to win. And so we immediately started cutting back dramatically on our budgets, not just for defense spending, but for diplomatic engagement, for foreign assistance, for informational programs about the United States, exchange programs, all the things that we've been doing all through the Cold War to try to not just advance our interests, but to convince the world of what we had to offer as a leader, in many respects as the leader. And there was a sense that we were also, if you think back in the terms, the world's only superpower. There was no Soviet Union anymore. There was no country that was even close to us in any regard, militarily, economically, in terms of influence. And there was a sense that the world was, as a lot of the political scientists said back then, unipolar, that there was just going to be one pole in the world, and that was us and our allies, and everyone else would somehow have to gather around it somehow. And then we had a series of experiences that reinforced that, starting with the first Gulf War, where we successfully put together an international coalition and turned back aggression rather successfully, rather quickly, and with relatively little loss of life, relatively low casualties. And that was a massive use of military force. And then in the Balkans, which Ernie's already touched on, we were able to change the course of history in the Balkans with a rather minimal amount of military power and use of force, with minimal loss of American lives, and basically reshape a corner of the world, a corner of Europe, basically the way we wanted to do it. And I personally would say for the better, but the key point is we were the player, we were the main driving force, and everyone looked to us. And that really was quite a moment, but the seeds of some problems were sown at that time, and one of them was the decision to defund our diplomacy, our international engagement. The sense at that point we had members of Congress, members of the Senate, saying, you know, we don't need embassies, we've got McDonald's, we've got Disney, we've got MTV, you know, people can learn about America if they want to, it's you know, we don't have to pay for that. And there really was that sense that we didn't have to earn our leadership. It was almost, you know, something that we had been given almost as a divine right. And unfortunately, those seeds of underfunding, but also of a sense of, you know, what I hate to use a communist term, but the communists always talked about historical inevitability, and the idea that history was inevitably going to go in the direction of communism and that worldview. Well, we had quite a bit of that going on. Not entirely wrongly, because I'm a believer in what we stand for and what our country can be and has been. And you know, let us not forget the bloody history of the 20th century and the two world wars and other wars. But the sense that we could basically coast and keep our leadership role, I think set the stage for a lot of what we've been through in the past 20 years, in the past 2 decades. I'm not going to delve into 9/11 and the counterterrorism challenge, nor Iraq and Afghanistan, except to say that the withdrawal from Afghanistan last August was really a wrenching moment for everyone who's contributed, who served, who was part of that 20-year adventure / misadventure, and is still reverberating certainly for all of my colleagues and everyone I know who devoted so much of their careers and their lives. But that period, and that was a 20-year period in which it has to be said our leadership role gradually was challenged, certainly by the rise of China and other important countries, but also degraded, and the fact that that was a 20-year period with very few international successes, certainly at the end of the day no military successes, has brought us to a period now where there's a bit of a reckoning, and the reckoning has been accelerated by what we're seeing right now in the towns and cities of Ukraine, where a lot of those, I would say, very well-meaning hopes of what the world could be and would be without a whole lot of funding and effort and resources on our part, have been shown to be illusions. And we're dealing once again with a very, very ugly world in many respects, one in which violence and use of force and cruelty and violation of international law and norms of behavior is back. And that was the kind of thing we hoped 30 years ago that we wouldn't have to confront again. So that, just to set the stage for where we find ourselves now, diplomatically, in terms of the areas that my colleagues and I in the U.S. Foreign Service are responsible for, we have been gradually defunded, de-resourced over the past 30 years. We're now spending about half in real dollar terms of what we spent at the end of the Cold War to represent America overseas, advance our interests, provide foreign assistance. And we're now Avis, we're no longer Hertz, for those of you who remember those commercials. We are the second diplomatic presence in the world. We're the second foreign assistance funder in the world. China has more embassies, more consulates, more diplomats, more aid programs. It's not all about numbers, it's not all about competition, and what we do is very different from what China does around the world. But there was this sense after World War II, we made a decision to be in the lead and to pay for it. And when President John F. Kennedy took office and all of the new countries in the decolonizing world were born, he said, we're going to have an embassy in every single one of those countries, and we're going to show every single one of those countries the same respect that we've shown the great powers of Europe and Asia, and we did. And we were the only country that did that for a very long time. But now there's another country that has an embassy in every country, and that is China. Not a bad thing. And this is not all about China. We can talk about that in the questions. But we're not number one in every respect, and in some cases we're number two and not holding our own, and that has something to do with resources. It also has to do with the change in attitude from our fellow citizens. After a very, very difficult 20 years, there's no question that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as I would say, painful and draining as they were not just for our military and our colleagues in the Foreign Service and all of the other members of our government and military who served there, but for our country. And they were also unbelievably expensive to, as I think you know, talking about at least $1 trillion. I think the real cost is more than that. To the expense of other things, including things like basic diplomatic representation and engagement and cultural exchange and other things that we just gradually defunded. So we're now faced with some real challenges in the question of whether we're going to be able to convince the American people to provide the resources we need, not for a new Cold War. No one wants that. I see some of the commentators are saying we're in one, and I don't think so. But nonetheless, you can't be paying any attention to the news if you don't have the sense that something has changed, and we are going to have to make some decisions about our role in the world and basically how we want to confront the biggest challenges we faced in a very long time, certainly since 9/11, but some would say earlier. And I think one of the most important things that has changed and has gone back in some ways in time is the fact that you now have the President of the United States talking about the free world. And that was a phrase that was absolutely banished. And I didn't hear for most of my career. Certainly I'm now in my 37th year doing this work, and I don't think, maybe my earliest years in Central America, occasionally you might hear that, but it was just considered, a hackneyed phrase, and we don't talk that way anymore, and it's one world, and things are going to go in our direction. And of course, for a while it looked like Russia was going in our direction. All of the Soviet Union's former satellites chose to join the world that we and our European allies and partners had created voluntarily. So I think we're at a moment now where one of the conversations we have to have among ourselves, but with the American people, is leadership isn't free. There's no question, certainly from my perspective and those of my colleagues who have committed their lives and careers to serving our country and advancing its interests, that we can't just coast if we care about our country's security and prosperity and the future of our next generations. That doesn't mean we have to go back, as I said, on some kind of Cold War footing. It doesn't necessarily mean, as some will tell you, that more defense spending is the right answer, although it's not necessarily the wrong answer. That question needs to be looked at very carefully, but I can tell you from our perspective, more spending on diplomacy and engagement with the world and exchange with the world and foreign assistance, but in a much more targeted and, I would say, responsive way, is unavoidable. And as Ernie said in the introduction, we're not talking about a lot of money in US government terms. All of the cliches you may have heard over the years that there are more musicians in the US military than diplomats in the Foreign Service, which is true. It's not even close, the numbers. The fact that we always talk about the disparities between the military and the Foreign Service in terms of what we call the 50 colonel syndrome, which is whatever priority is established, the military can always throw 50 colonels or Navy captains at it at a moment's notice. And if we can find one person to join that working group or task force, that's a good thing, and it's frequently a struggle. We don't have the ability to train adequately. One of the things that we're missing is the kind of leadership training that happens, I won't say automatically, it happens with a lot of attention and care and funding in our military institutions, but we don't really have anything close to that. We do still get language training, and it's one of the blessings of the profession, and I've been lucky enough to be able to study several languages at our Foreign Service Institute full-time, which is really a wonderful thing to be able to study languages as your job for a certain amount of time. But otherwise, we need to do a lot more there. And we need to rethink about what we do in the world, how we want to do it. The challenge now with Russia and Ukraine is, I think, in many respects, the biggest that I can recall facing, certainly in my career. I won't say it's necessarily bigger than the 9/11 challenge, but I didn't have that as a focus of what I was working on, unlike so many of my colleagues. I won't try to compare it to Southeast Asian, the Vietnam War. I know there are people here who served and have personal memories. I don't think we need to do that, but it really is a very, very major moment. And I think we all know that. The question is, what does it mean and where are we going? And I think one thing it means is predictability is gone. I can tell you that no one I know, including a lot of very, very smart experts, saw this coming quite the way it happened. And to be fair, I don't think very many people in Russia or Ukraine saw this coming, including the Ukrainian leadership that was very unhappy with our government for publicly saying that we had intelligence showing that the Russians were preparing to attack. I think that predictability is not only gone, but it really pertains to everything. So I've been asked in a few talks, you know, can you rule out the possibility of nuclear conflict after all these years? We can't possibly be facing that. And my answer would be, I still believe fervently that it's very, very unlikely. It certainly doesn't make sense in any way. But if the question is it absolutely impossible that we could be facing nuclear conflict with a rogue, cornered, angry Russia, I think any person who looked at it now would have to say, yes, it is. Again, a small chance. I don't just want to believe that. I do believe that, and the people who are much smarter than I am who study this for a living say that as well. But we haven't been in this territory before. The other thing is we're really dealing with a challenge to the whole international system that was developed after World War II, which reshaped through the United Nations, through the Bretton Woods Agreement, through all of the international institutions, the World Bank, the IMF. Frankly, even the European Union was really our project, going back to the 1940s. And this world order was essentially designed mostly by Americans. And now, all of those institutions are under threat. We just saw President Zelensky of Ukraine ask the United Nations directly, what is the United Nations for if it can't deal with a crisis like this? He said to the Security Council, what kind of security are you talking about? If you don't deal with this, then there's no point, you might as well just go home. It's a very serious challenge. On arms control, we've been going backwards for, unfortunately, about 20 years, and prospects are very, very small that we can get back on any real effort, to limit the spread of arms, including nuclear arms. So this is going to be a dangerous time in that regard. But I think also we really have to now think about the fact that we're living in a world which has always had good and evil. We know that. That's just how it's always been. But we're now dealing with, as President Biden has said, as other world leaders, Prime Minister Johnson of the UK just said, President Macron gave a speech about this week. You know, this is evil, and this is evil with 5,600 nuclear weapons, and the ability to affect the whole world. So this is a challenge in that regard. I think we're up to it, and I think the most positive aspect that I've seen of this crisis, in addition to the heroic resistance of democratic Ukraine, which is inspiring, and honestly something that I did expect, having lived there and having had such close relationships with Ukrainians, but not quite to this extent. It's truly awe-inspiring. But the other piece that I think is so powerful is that we really do have an alliance of democracies again around the world. And this alliance is a majority of the world's economy, and it is by far, I think, the most powerful and influential part of the world, but by no means able to just run the world or dictate the way the Western powers used to be able to do. But nonetheless, the success that we've had, and we have to give credit to the leaders of all the European allies and other countries in the European Union, of Japan and South Korea, Australia and New Zealand, Canada obviously, but also so many other countries around the world that have made the hard decision to join in this effort to stop what's going on. That's hopeful, and we were losing that, honestly, in the past 10 or 20 years. And the sense that united we stand, divided we fall, I think, is back. And that's really important. So we're acting in concert with pretty much all the other democracies, and even some of the semi-democracies around the world, and there are a lot of those. And I believe that is one of the things that will enable us to not only turn back this challenge, but actually see it through to a positive outcome. The problem is it's going to be a wrenching, painful, and sadly, I think, a tragic time to get there. So this is the challenge that we're facing as a country. As I mentioned, as a foreign service, just a few words about who we are and what we do. We actually are not just the State Department, but 6 U.S. government departments and agencies serving overseas and in Washington. Our association and union represents almost 17,000 members, but all told there are about 30,000 members of the Foreign Service, which is, you know, as Ernie said, a typographical error in terms of not just the military, but most other government agencies. But it's an incredibly talented, I would say, fascinating group of people who deal with a lot of hardships and a lot of challenges, and frankly, with being ignored a lot. There's just so little understanding of of what the Foreign Service is and what it does. And we all have stories of going to high school reunions and someone says, what do you do? And you say, I'm with the State Department, and they say, the State Department of what? That really happens a lot, actually. Or if you say Foreign Service, they think, French Foreign Legion or something like that. There's some of that, but we are career professionals, non-political, non-partisan, apolitical, serving every administration elected by the American people. But not to say that that's always easy, and we've had some people in some horrific situations. We lost some of our colleagues in Iraq and Afghanistan. Sadly, we lose some of our colleagues every year. We have a wall in the lobby of the State Department with hundreds of names of our colleagues who've died in the line of duty. And we add more every year. Every year on May 8th, we have a ceremony with the Secretary of State, and I'll be doing that with Secretary Blinken. So that's part of the real cost. But also, people go around the world and hopefully are able to take their families with them or drag their families with them. And that can be a great adventure, and it can also be very hard. There's some of the things that we do, and I think in terms of what our colleagues want to see is just the ability to meet this challenge that we're dealing with right now. There's some hopeful movement in Congress. We just got a temporary budget for this year that gives us a little more, but we're pushing hard for getting back to doing things properly, to staffing our embassies, being represented around the world. So with that, I want to open up to questions, and I don't want to run over and do that, but I did want to say, before I wrap up, just this has been an amazing adventure. I think I mostly speak for Nicole and our kids on that, but it's also, there's something about the feeling of service, service to country, service to others, that's really powerful. And especially at a time like this, one of the reasons I'm doing what I'm doing in this job, to try to help my colleagues serve and do what they can in this crazy world, is just the sense of any ability to make a small difference is important. So thanks for coming and listening, and I look forward to a really great conversation. Thank you very much.